Okay, what if the lessons from one of America's darkest days are about to be repeated? In this explainer, we're going to unpack a really chilling historical comparison. It's one that links the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor to the modern standoff between the United States and Iran. Now, that is a pretty provocative idea, so let's just dive right in.
And really, this is the question that frames our entire discussion. Could a surprise attack of that magnitude actually happen again in the 21st century? And if it did, what would that even look like? The idea that we could repeat mistakes from the past, well, that's a serious one. So let's break this argument down, piece by piece.
And believe it or not, according to this analysis, it all comes down to this number, $20 billion. That's the estimated value of a single U.S. asset that, if it were attacked, could be the trigger for a modern-day Pearl Harbor. So what is this asset, and why is its potential loss so incredibly significant? Let's find out.
All right, so first up, let's really unpack the core idea. What is this modern Pearl Harbor scenario that's being proposed? What does it actually mean?
Well, the argument is pretty straightforward. It's that a successful Iranian attack on a U.S. aircraft carrier, that wouldn't just be a military loss. No, it would be a political catalyst, a modern-day Pearl Harbor that could, in theory, push the United States into an all-out war. Now, to really get why this comparison is being made, we've got to look back at the original event, right? So let's do a quick history refresh. Let's revisit the key details of that 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor.
You know, we all know the name, but it's always worth a quick refresh. December 7th, 1941. It's the date President Roosevelt famously called a date which will live in infamy. The Imperial Japanese Navy launched this absolutely devastating surprise attack, and it's what ultimately dragged a very reluctant United States into the Second World War.
So this timeline here really shows you just how fast everything happened. You've got the early 1940s, and Japan is aggressively expanding its empire all across the Pacific. Then, bam, December 7th, 1941. They attack Pearl Harbor. Their hope? To totally neutralize the U.S. fleet. But wow, did that plan backfire. The very next day, the U.S. is officially in the war, and that path ultimately leads to Japan's defeat in 1945.
So, why? Why did Japan attack in the first place? Well, from their point of view, it was a calculated risk. They were hoping to deliver a kind of knockout blow to the U.S. Navy. The idea was to buy themselves the time and space they needed to conquer Southeast Asia. It was all about a quick, decisive strike to keep America on the sidelines.
But that is not what happened. As the analysis we're looking at puts it, Japan's backbone was broken. Instead of being scared off, America was awakened. You know the phrase, the sleeping giant. And that attack didn't just lead to Japan's defeat, it led to its complete and utter devastation. What looked like a stunning tactical victory turned into an absolute strategic catastrophe.
Okay, so let's shift gears. Let's fast forward from history to the present day and take a look at the standoff between the U.S. and Iran, because that's the whole basis for this comparison.
So this analysis really zeroes in on the heavy U.S. military presence in the region as a huge factor. You've got the deployment of these massive assets, like the USS Abraham Lincoln Aircraft Carrier Group, and what that does is it creates this incredibly high-stakes environment where you have a ton of valuable targets all packed into one very tense area.
And yeah, the rhetoric, it's been escalating dramatically, and on both sides. Take this quote, for example, attributed to former President Trump. It makes the American position crystal clear. Any provocation would be met with just overwhelming force.
And then, from the Iranian side, a totally defiant response. This quote shows they have zero willingness to back down, promising a 200% strong countermove. You can see how this just adds more and more fuel to an already dangerous fire.
The analysis also lays out the key demands the U.S. has for Iran. And these are basically the conditions for de-escalation. We're talking about major changes to their nuclear program, halting their ballistic missile program, and stopping their support for proxy forces in the region. I mean, these are the absolute core issues at the very heart of the standoff.
Okay, now let's zoom in on the heart of this whole hypothetical scenario, the attack on that $20 billion target. What would an attack like that actually look like?
Right, so the scenario being imagined here isn't just some simple skirmish at sea. No, we're talking about a sophisticated, coordinated, and, critically, successful attack. Something that would likely use a swarm of drones and missiles to completely overwhelm the defenses of a major U.S. naval asset, specifically an aircraft carrier.
And that $20 billion figure, it represents so much more than just the cost of a ship. It's a floating symbol of American power. It's home to thousands of American lives. A loss on that scale would be just a profound shock to the entire system.
And according to this analysis, it's the shock of a loss like that that would be the real trigger. It wouldn't just be seen as a military defeat. It would be a deep psychological blow. And that could create immense political and public pressure for a massive and maybe even disproportionate retaliation.
All right, so in our final section, let's bring all these threads together and really unpack the dire warning that's at the very heart of this analysis. This chart here does a great job of breaking down the comparison. Look, in both scenarios, the target is a huge symbol of American naval power. The goal, for the attacker, is to land a shocking, asymmetric blow. But the potential aftermath, that's the most important parallel here. A devastating, all-out response from the United States. Ultimately, this whole thing really boils down to this one single chilling warning. It's that classic lesson of the sleeping giant, isn't it? For a smaller power, the temptation to score a dramatic, tactical victory, it can be huge. But doing so might just provoke a strategic response so overwhelming that it leads to their own ruin. And all of this brings us to a final, really crucial question. When nations draw these parallels to the past, like with Pearl Harbor, are they actually using history as a warning to avoid repeating mistakes? Or are they just using it as a script for what comes next? It's definitely a question worth thinking about as we watch these kinds of tensions unfold around the world.